Hello and welcome to Groovecast, the podcast for the rhythm section with me, Ashley-Walke.
And me, Charliesmith.
And I'm really excited about this episode. I don't know about you, Charlie, because we're talking about one of my favourite things, and I think one of your favourite things as well, the Beatles.
Yeah. As some of you may or may not have seen, we put a little video out the other day, sort of in relation to this episode, but not really explaining it very much. So we'll kind of go into that a bit later on. But yeah, a bit of a look at Beatles stuff after the Beatles.
Yeah, I think sort of from a period that, to be honest, it's kind of my favourite at the moment period in the Beatles' history, and I do still class it as the Beatles, even though John Lennon was no longer alive. And it's kind of, we're focusing on that period where, in the 90s, where the Beatles got together with Jeff Lynne, who we talked about in our last episode, so we're kind of following on from that a little bit.
Bit of a continuation.
And yes, it's we're kind of focusing in on those three songs, Free as a Bird, Real Love, which they did in the 90s, and then obviously they started working on the song Now and Then, which they released finally last November, I believe it was, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And we'll probably focus a little bit more on Free as a Bird, because that is the... If you haven't seen that video, click off this one and go back on my YouTube channel and watch it. We did our best attempt.
Yeah, so we'll sort of come into why and how we put that together. Probably towards the end of this episode, we've got a fair bit to dig through beforehand. We were just discussing before we started recording. Usually, our notes for an episode like this are about half a page long. My colleague over there wrote a page and a half of research and notes on this, so we'll try and cover everything. We probably will miss a few things, but yeah, this is a pretty full-on look at three songs.
Yeah, it started about a couple of weeks ago for me when I read an article about the making of these songs and it kind of got really into the specifics of how Jeff Lynne fixed those cassettes in the 90s. And as many know, it started in the whole thing kind of started in about 1977 when John Lennon recorded onto a cassette 4 demos of songs he'd written, which were obviously Free as a Bird, Real Love, a song called Grow Old With Me, and Now and Then.
Yeah, and I know people always bang on about the quality of those tapes, but actually I was watching a video with a researcher and sort of vinyl collector and looking at the way that some of these tracks were put together, and so if you haven't checked them out, go and look at Parlogram's videos on YouTube, because they're incredible and they're very, very well put together, especially if you're a vinyl collector and Beatles fanatic. But he said the tape recorder that John was actually recording on was, I think, a Sony 2-track Sony cassette recorder machine, which was actually probably the best cassette recorder you could buy at the time for home use. And you could run microphones into it or whatever. But I think, from what I heard, I think John just had it on the top of the piano using the internal microphone and maybe a pair of headphones. Which sort of explains why some of those demos are very piano heavy and the vocal sort of gets a bit lost, and then you have all the hiss and stuff from the cassette probably just being thrown around or put in a drawer and all that for years. And as we'll come to on Now and Then, there was the mains hum issue, which is a big part of why it was sort of shelved back in the 90s. But let's go back and sort of do it chronologically. So, getting hold of the tapes, I think they were passed to Paul at, was it the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame?
Yeah, when he inducted John Lennon. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this came about a bit before then with, I think you said it was George Harrison.
Yeah, in that article that I mentioned before, I believe he was speaking to some of Elvis's ex-band members, and they were talking about using some of Elvis's old concert things and sort of lifting him out of the mix to do a live show or make an album. So just in passing, George Harrison mentioned that idea to Yoko Ono, and I believe that was when she then said, she had these tapes and if they'd like to do something with them.
And I think, as we say, I think she passed them to Paul at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction, and the rest, they say, is history as far as that's concerned. Because of course then the Anthology project came about, which would have been, I'm going to guess, early 90s, 91, 92, and that was first talked about. And then I think the idea came around of having one new song per anthology part. So, one for Anthology 1, one for 2, one for 3. And I believe the plan was going to be Free as a Bird on Anthology 1, Real Love on Anthology 2, and then Now and Then on Anthology 3. And I know they also had Grow Old With Me, but I think, did you say I think they got rid of that fairly early on.
I've heard mixed things. One of them was the reason they abandoned it was because it had already been included on that album Milk and Honey, which they released, the John Lennon album, which they released after his death. And also I heard another thing that they just thought it was too morbid even for them to do it. But Ringo did do a cover of it in, I think, 2018 on one of either an EP or an album, and got Paul McCartney on bass and vocals, and it's like a nice version of it, so it's definitely worth checking out. For that.
I think there was also talk that at the time, Paul, George and Ringo didn't realise that these demos of Lennon's actually had been released. I can't remember what they were released on. I think it was a John Lennon anthology, or whether or not they'd just been bootlegged early on. But I think they were surprised that they were already out there. They didn't realise they had actually been released, but they were out there because fans had heard them, but they hadn't obviously heard what was going to be done to them.
No. Yeah, I'd say in terms of sort of secrets, Now and Then's probably one of the worst kept secrets, because and we'll get into probably later, but and we watched we sent over a video when we were doing our research for this of sort of the history of Now and Then, and it was, I think, one of the first videos on YouTube when YouTube became big, like the bootlegged version people had done of it, and so people always kind of had an idea that was going to be the last song, but like with all of them, fans knew them already, amazingly.
Yeah, it's actually surprising when you really look into it how much there is that it hadn't been released. There's a whole Paul McCartney 1967 composition called Carnival of Light. I don't know if you ever read about that, which was tipped to be on, and it was either going to be on the Beatles Rarities or something like that, and George Harrison apparently vetoed it. He said, I'm not having that on there. And it was a Paul McCartney thing that was used once for some big event in London, and it hasn't ever been heard since.
Yeah, I think it was a bit avant-garde, wasn't it? And
I think it was totally avant-garde.
That's what I heard. So when it comes to production on these songs, people sort of wondered why George Martin wasn't involved on the 90s on those songs that were used for Anthology, and I think one of the main reasons was because his hearing by that period was going, and he kind of didn't feel he could do his best work anymore. And then obviously there was the thing of McCartney and George Harrison's kind of relationship by then not being brilliant. And I think bringing someone like Jeff Lynne on board would be good to have him to sort of mediate the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, I think even Paul McCartney said probably in the Jeff Lynne documentary, he says it was good to have someone just to manage the egos, if nothing else. And, and deal with everything. So they had Jeff, which obviously George Harrison had worked with, and I think Ringo had met him. I don't know if he'd worked with him by that point, but they definitely met. And you also had Neil Aspinall, who was the sort of head of Apple Corps at the time, who was around because he was sort of managing the Anthology project. So I think he was around and about as well, as sort of probably a bit of a personal assistant to all of them. And then there was also, I think, Mark Mann, who worked on the cassettes.
Yeah, I think I heard his name before, but I didn't match the face to the name, and you can see him on the. He obviously must have been good friends with George Harrison and Jeff Lynne, because he ended up being on the concert for George that they did a few years later. Obviously, that tribute concert to George Harrison. On this article, when it got into the real breaking down how they fixed the cassettes, I think he was instrumental in that with Jeff Lynne, and I believe they kind of did it in the States, where Mark Mann and Jeff Lynne were kind of based at the time, and I think they sort of, there was obviously, as we mentioned before, all the hiss to deal with, and then also the fact that John Lennon's piano was like slightly out of tune, so
and the tempo
they had to
was
kind
all
of get
over
it
the
into a
place.
key. So I think he was massive in that, and if anybody can find this article, go and check it out. We're not going to get into the real specifics of how they did it, but I know part of it was they had to really splice up the tape and go verse by verse, and in some cases bar by bar, and clean it up, and they obviously did a really good job on it.
Yeah.
On Free as a Bird and Real Love.
Yeah, but obviously the big elephant in the room was why they shelved Now and Then, which was pretty much at that point, or not long after. They got a version of the cassette cleaned up, but not cleaned up enough. To be really workable, and they laid some guide tracks down, Paul, Ringo, and George, and then, as Paul McCartney put it, George went off it.
I think from this article and our research, it seems that, and from Mark Mann's own words, he said that he wasn't happy with it because he only had a set amount of time. He'd done Free as a Bird, and I think he might have done Real Love, and then he was only given X amount of days to work on Now and Then before Jeff Lynne had to go back to England to work with the Beatles for the remaining Beatles for that short time period they had free. So he could only get it so good, and as soon as it was played to them, I think they all realised it wasn't good enough, and that hum that you were talking about earlier, I think, was particularly annoying to him. I think, to quote George Harrison, he said afterwards, "I hope somebody does this with all my old demos after I die, make them into hits."
What I didn't actually realise, but there was a year between them doing Free as a Bird and doing Real Love and starting Now and Then. I didn't actually realise it was that long. You sort of assume all that have done all three at once, or been at least working on them at vaguely the same time. It was actually a full year. I think they did Free as a Bird. They started in '94 to get it out in '95 with Anthology 1, and they didn't start Real Love until '95 to get it out in '96 with Anthology 2.
Yeah.
So it was actually it was a whole year between them working on Free as a Bird and then starting the other two. So that's probably lines up pretty well with why Jeff Lynne was probably in a rush to get back over with Real Love and the Now and Then tape if the Now and Then one wasn't up to scratch. So it does sort of explain it, because if you listen to Anthology 3 now, it is a bit weird that it's missing that lead single, that new song that the other two both had.
Yeah, one of the things looking into this that I didn't realise, because I know obviously neither of us were alive when these songs came out, and I hadn't heard of them properly till about 5 years ago or something like that, reading a book and about Paul McCartney, and sort of the perception that I had of it were that these songs weren't successful at all as in Free as a Bird and Real Love. But Free as a Bird was like went to number 2, didn't it? And
it went to number 2, but it was still judged a failure at the time, which is bizarre.
yeah,
But it's successful in the sense that it was high in the charts. I don't think Real Love did as well.
no,
I think might have made the top 10, but not by much. I can't quite remember off the top of my head. But yeah, what it was, they decided to release Free as the Bird at the same time that someone else had released. I think it was Michael Jackson had put something out.
Earth Song.
That was it, and that was probably the stupidest idea that they ever had.
Yeah,
and it was to the detriment of the song that it didn't hit number 1 because of that.
Yeah, I love the story that the label or whoever it was that released Earth Song or Michael Jackson's people sent, because it was New Year, I believe, or Christmas. They sent EMI, I think it was, or Derek Taylor in particular, a turkey with the Free as a Bird rammed up its jack seat, and basically to say your song's a turkey.
Yeah, I heard that story too.
I kind of hope it's true, to be honest, just for the fair enough.
But yeah, as the things you do in the music business, eh? But
oh my god.
But yeah, but yes, to sort of bring Now and Then up to date, it was sort of shelved in 1996 or 97, and then the next I really heard of it was Paul McCartney talking about it on the Jeff Lynne documentary, and he mentioned it there. And to quote, he said, "I want to nick in and finish it one day with Jeff." And I think, although a lot of the work got done on it in 2021, I think your notes say they did something in 2013 with it as well.
Yeah, that was the most surprising thing to me, and I kind of loved reading about it in this article, that over the course of that 25 years or whatever it was, or McCartney would keep pulling it out of his archives, and because he always has an engineer in his studio in Sussex, I believe it is. He'd always, every now and then when he'd have a few days free, he would ask to hear it and try and work on it. And I think he tried to include it on that Chaos and Creations, which we were talking about before we started recording. And he tried to work on it in either 2012 or 2013. He kind of thought the technology might have caught up enough. But as we know, it wasn't really until Peter Jackson got involved that it got serious. Yeah,
which kind of makes sense of why it might have been at the front of his mind when he was doing the Jeff Lynne documentary. If he'd been looking at it or was thinking of looking at it then, that would kind of stack up in terms of dates, because I think the Jeff Lynne thing was about 2012. That was put out, so it was probably made within the 6 months, year ahead of it being released.
Yeah. And I remember when it was like announced and everything, the last Beatles song, I was just so excited, and that whole build up of, I know we were sending each other messages when they announced it was going to be Now and Then, and they put out the cassette thing, and it was like a new holiday for me, like a Christmas day.
Yeah, which is annoying, because then it ended up taking a lot longer to be released because of no fault of its own, because they decided to rework the Red and the Blue albums, and then to add Now and Then onto the Blue album. And so apparently the delay was because Giles Martin was remixing all of the Blue album and the stuff, and he had to get it done so that Now and Then could come out, because I think Now and Then should have actually been released in August last year, and kept getting put. It was put back by months to November, and I think even Ringo Starr got a bit cheesed off at the fact that it hadn't been released yet.
Yeah,
I think he did an interview with someone, and they said, "Oh, when's the next Beatles song coming out?" And he went, "I don't know when they can be bothered to release it," or something something like that, you know. But it turns out that's what it was. It was because they then decided, in their infinite wisdom, that it needed to come out with an album as well as a single. So they got Giles Martin to go to work doing the remixes on the Red and the Blue album, which, to be honest, half of them he'd probably already done. So all of the Pepper stuff, all of the
Revolver, I think he'd done.
Revolver he'd done, the White Album, and Let It Be Abbey Road. But all of the early stuff, anything pre-67, hadn't had the demixing and remixing treatment. And that was the delay. So that's why it took 3 months longer to come out than it actually needed to.
Yeah, I think, in reading this article, they really go into, how it kind of got together and how McCartney got the track together with the order he did things. And one of the things that they talked in detail about was the string session when he went to Capitol Studios and, to hear the string arrangement. And I really wish I could remember now, but he said what they called the piece of music, and when it was on the music stands, it had a different name, obviously, and they, as is kind of typical for a string recording session, they take the vocals off the track. So I think it was a really stripped down thing. So nobody other than him, Giles Martin, I think the engineer in the room, nobody else knew what it was that they were recording. And
I saw that same thing in the Now and Then documentary. I did wonder if any of the string players were Beatles fans to a point of knowing about the demo and knowing, if any of them had actually put two and two together and gone, I think I know what this is, but I'm going to keep my mouth shut. You never really know. But but I think it's quite common on a string session anyway, to just, all they want is the rhythm track. They don't really want to hear what else is going on.
No.
Because it's all about getting the sound between the strings to be right. Make sure everyone's together and hearing that session was I'm glad Peter Jackson or whoever it was managed to get cameras in the room when they were doing that.
Yeah, I think we're going to go back, and sort of talk about Free as a Bird and Real Love, because Free as a Bird is the one we worked on. But with the Now and Then thing, I'd say go and check out on YouTube the isolated things that you can go and see now. You can hear all of the tracks isolated. And I think that string arrangement is so George Martin-esque, and his son Giles did an awesome job on it.
Yeah, I've got to say, I don't know about you, the most spine-chilling bit was the day before Now and Then came out, when they released the documentary, and you just heard the isolated vocals. It was just John, but it sounded, there was no hiss, there was no inclination at all that was a cassette recording that was 50-odd-year-old. And it just was like, that was when I heard that, I was like, oh, this is going to be great. This is, even if the song is terrible, the fact that they've got this together is going to be incredible. Yeah, it was, and I think just the way it was all done in the build up to it, although it took longer than we would have liked, I think the video, that 12-minute documentary, the music video, I just think it was all done so perfectly. Yeah. But we shall come back to that in a bit, and we'll dip back onto Real Love and Free as a Bird.
Yeah.
So I know you've done a little bit of a breakdown of probably all three of the songs. So I'll let you take the lead, and I'll just pop in every now and again if I've got something to add.
Well, I won't get as into it as because I think everyone would fall asleep at that point. But yeah, obviously Free as a Bird, before Now and Then, was my sort of favourite Beatles song, and we talked about it in our Track of the Week thing that we did last year, so you should go check that out on our Facebook page and Instagram. But yeah, I think it's a great song, really underrated, and us working on it for that little project really gave me a new appreciation of it from a standpoint of sort of the chords, because I tried to learn learned the verse on the acoustic guitar, and sort of sort of the fact it sort of starts, I think, in A major, and goes to an F sharp minor to F major 7, which is just such a weird transition. It's not something you would think of, writing songs, but yeah, you can't really tell that it's so weird, and when you're listening to it, but very effective. And all of the 3 songs from this period, you can really see the style that John Lennon was writing in at the time, and so I think that's one of them. And I think that whole little project started with you on drums, didn't it? And the playing along to the tracks.
Yeah,
Free as a bird.
What sort of set this off was, obviously, you came up with, wanting to talk about this for an episode, which I was totally down for. And in sort of doing my own bit of research, I came across someone on YouTube who had isolated down the tracks, before the Giles Martin demixing thing came about. I don't know whether or not they just EQ'd it, or I know there was some tracks you could get stems for from the Beatles Rock Band video game. So I don't know where it came from, but there was these isolated tracks, and I had a little listen to them, and I thought, I wonder if you pulled them all into Logic or into a DAW, I wonder if they would all line up and sync. And so I gave it a go. I, got hold of the MP3s, pulled them into Logic, and just had a listen. And I just had, everything was totally flat, hadn't mixed it, hadn't adjusted anything. And you line all the tracks up, and then you go, oh, there's the song. The complete song in, I think it was 4 or 5 tracks. I think there was a drum track, bass track, obviously a vocal track, guitar track, and then piano track as well, I think was the way it was all sort of organised. And obviously when you then get that, you then go, right, well now I can mute stuff and redo it. And I'd been playing around in my studio with some sort of 60s very Ringo-y sounds, putting tea towels on all the drums and getting some old cymbals out, a bit like you can see sort of behind me if you're watching this on YouTube. I've got some. This was all for a session I did yesterday, again in that sort of similar vein of using, vintage gear and old snare drums and all that, which is, I'm all for that. So it's right up my street. So I just did it. I sort of hatched the plan of going, well, if I could put drums on it, and then you could put bass on it. And I think I just sort of shot you a message late that night and went, I've had this really crazy idea, but see what you think. And within 24 hours, we had a mix of it. Talk about working fast. I laid the drums down in the morning, and there was bass on it by tea time, and then it was just you sort of took ownership and went, okay, if we've put drums and bass on it, why don't we take the vocals off? And you fancied having a crack at re-recording all of those vocals, which was incredible to hear back. And I think you put a bit of acoustic guitar on. I put some tambourine. I think you put some shaker on it as well. And we just sort of organically built it up over about 2 days. It is one of the fastest projects I think we've ever done.
Yeah, and some more in the works, so keep an eye out for that.
Yeah, I think we've opened a little Pandora's box with this of finding isolated stems on the in the depth of the internet and then doing things with them has become, because it's quite an enjoyable thing, but it's also great to hear some of that stuff in isolation. To hear what was being done by Ringo on a particular Beatles song where the drums are just totally buried in the mix is actually quite nice to be able to go back and have a look. And then obviously with the demixing stuff that Peter Jackson's team in Australia started to develop, and then obviously Giles Martin's been using on all of the remasters and the remixes of Beatles stuff lately. I think that's just going to open this up even further as time goes on, and that technology makes it out of their clutches and into into a version that people will use in home studios to isolate stuff from. Because I saw some stuff, I think it was when Giles Martin was demixing Revolver, and he got Taxman up and he went, right, here's the guitar and the bass channels and the drums, and they're all glued together, and then here's just the kick drum, and then here's just the snare drum, and here's just hand claps that was glued into a take of vocal harmonies and guitar solo. And when I saw that, I was like, this has just took a totally different step. And the complete freedom that they can not only do that with Beatles records, but anything else that was recorded in that same way of, bouncing tracks and tracks and tracks. I would love to see Giles Martin do Sgt. Pepper with it. I think that'll be one of the next probably big projects that he looks at, because I know he remixed it for its 50th anniversary, which would have been about 2016, 2017. He did a remaster of it, which I've got on vinyl somewhere. But I would like to hear him demix that and see what was hidden in some of those tracks.
Yeah, I think it's a really good tool, and for all that demixing stuff, and to learn parts for something like this project that we embarked upon last week. To learn, and it's great for Beatles bass lines in particular, because as you were saying before with the drums, sometimes it can be buried in the mix, specific things, and it's the same with some of the bass lines. So to learn the bass line for this, the Free as a Bird video that we did, it's all there on YouTube, and you can hear exactly what McCartney played, which kind of gave me the kind of realised that this is the track. I think he played a 5-string on it, or certainly in places, to get that low.
I'm sure, actually, I read somewhere it might have been a Fender Jazz.
Yeah.
I don't know for sure, but it might have been a Fender Jazz. And
I think you might be right.
We were saying earlier as well, he was using Bill Black's Elvis upright bass, which he's had for forever. So I think he did pretty well to approximate that by going for a halfway house and having a violin bass.
Yeah, well, you can't not use it, can you? On a Beatles song.
Yeah, no, I think and that was the other thing we sort of really tried to aim for, was sound. It wasn't just the playing and the placement and the approach to that side of it, but trying to get the sound right, which is not easy in little home studios, where we haven't got an Abbey Road and a great engineer and multi-million pounds worth of microphones and stuff. But yeah, it's surprising how, with a bit of work and a bit of time in there, you can actually dial things in pretty close. At least I can in here with drums, which is quite good. It's sort of a room that's live enough without being like a warehouse. And then obviously with you getting the bass, I don't know if you were, I would imagine, were you going DI? And then and the thing particularly I was worried about, or how to kind of do it, were the vocals, as we were saying before, and more sort of, as you're saying, the sound. And so with the lead vocal, I slapped on quite a lot of reverb, because to try and get that sound of the cassette on the recording, you can tell obviously it's not the same quality as Now and Then, with the lead vocal, and then with the harmonies and the backing vocals, just the sounds on them. When it came to doing those sort of middle sections where Paul McCartney takes lead vocal and then George Harrison does, I know you can tell that there's not much reverb on them, and in George Harrison's case, there's like none at all. It sounds pretty dry, because I know from interviews he said he absolutely hated reverb by this point and didn't like the fact that he used to use it. So when it came to that, I took almost all the reverb off it, and which is just so harsh. And then, as we've sort of
touched on before, the harmonies, and especially in that, although on our isolated tracks we had some of the harmonies still on there in the guitar solo, like they're very sort of quiet, so I wanted to just give them a little boost. But then I've heard it on the record and listened again. Go on YouTube and check out the isolated. You can hear exactly what George Harrison and Paul McCartney are doing, and it's hard, but I thought it can't be that hard to just kind of recreate. And it's just like, oh my gosh, that's such new appreciation for those guys. So I kind of muddled my way through it.
Yeah, it took me back when you were saying about it to fire back to the Jeff Lynne thing, when Jeff was talking about it, and he says he was sat in Paul McCartney's studio and Neil Aspinall came looking for him, going, the boys are wondering if you can check these harmonies they're working on, and he was like, what, me check them? Okay, okay.
Yeah, I love that.
It's a great clip and a great quote. I'm sure we'll probably dig it out and stick it on the socials.
Fire that
with this episode, because some of those clips from that documentary and some of the other mentions of it are just incredible. And obviously as well, with the Now and Then thing, it's uncovered all of this archive footage that the levels which I didn't realise was hidden in the vaults. I think someone said there's about 9 hours worth of studio footage from the 90s of McCartney's studio. So I think we're both hoping Peter Jackson gets his mitts on that and can do something a bit more extended with it than just the little Now and Then documentary.
Yeah, I love in that during the Now and Then documentary, and I've seen it on a couple of other things where George Harrison and Paul McCartney are sat outside having a cup of tea, and George Harrison's trying to remember Norwegian Wood, and it's on at the start of Now and Then. They've left it in this little dung 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 dung. He's trying to work it out. It's really funny moment.
Yeah, it's also good with the Now and Then thing. I don't know if we mentioned this. Speaking of harmonies, that they put because in there.
Yeah.
They extracted the harmonies from because, which I think they'd done that years ago, because they had. I don't know if you remember the Beatles' Love album, the Cirque du Soleil thing. There's a version of Because on there, and I think it's on the Anthology, where it's just vocals, no harpsichord. The guitar solo might be in the middle. The Moog or Moog synth solo might be in the middle, but it is just raw harmonies, and that's a chilling listen as well. It's incredible just to hear the close harmonies of the three or four of them in 1968-69 when they were recording that. It's like it total gives you shivers.
Yeah, I think as well, with the isolated things, to hear the closeness of the harmonies between George Harrison and Paul McCartney on Free as a Bird and Real Love, a massive sort of praise has to go to Jeff Lynne for that, although I know a lot of that would have been George Harrison and Paul McCartney's own invention. The fact, you can definitely hear his stamp on there with the style, and obviously he's influenced by the Beatles, and for me that was the one thing, if I was to sort of compare the songs, the thing that's sort of missing a little bit from Now and Then is obviously a bit more of George Harrison's input, because he's no longer alive. And when you listen to sort of, especially the harmonies to Real Love, you can really hear his presence in the harmonies, and that low harmony he would always do in the Beatles. So yeah, I know some people say they love Now and Then because they hated Free as a Bird and Real Love and thought Jeff Lynne just did too much to it, which I think's a load of rubbish, to be honest. And then some people hate Now and Then because they say, oh, it just sounds like ELO, it just sounds like the Electric. Well, you know what? He's influenced by the Beatles, so,
John Lennon was a big fan of ELO back in the mid-70s. He used to call them Son of Beatles.
Yeah.
Or Sons of Beatles, because he really liked what they were doing with technology that even 10 years on, the Beatles didn't have. I think he was quoted as saying Showdown was his favourite record at the time on some New York radio show. And I can understand why. If you go and listen to Showdown, it's very much what, you hear. the string stuff is very Eleanor Rigby, you know, really choppy strings. But then with that sort of glassy, really smooth sound that Jeff Lynne had, which is very sort of reminiscent of what the Beatles were doing in that sort of mid to later period, when everything was very, you know, loads of harmonies and lots of layering, and yeah, it's just a lot of thought that went into it, which, yeah, I think that's what Jeff's all about as much as anyone else.
Yeah, and sort of going to the two songs from the 90s, Free as a Bird and Real Love, I've always thought it's some of George Harrison's best guitar playing as a Beatle. You know, and I've said before, I think on our track of the week thing, and you know, when it goes from that middle section with him taking the lead vocal into the guitar solo, still now it just gives me chills, just because I think it's a great, and just kind of speaks to that thing of the Beatles always knowing exactly what to play.
Yeah, well, it is. And even doing the tracking in here and listening back to our mix of it, I'm sorry, you know, as much as I love your harmonies, the bit I always look forward to is that guitar solo.
Yeah.
You know, just because it's just so right and so special. It just has such a vibe to it that I just go, yeah, that was someone who was, even at that point, totally at their peak when they recorded that, you know, and went and, you know, because it takes a lot to go, yeah, what this needs is a slide guitar on it.
Yeah.
You know, from George Harrison, and it was totally the thing to do.
Yeah, and I think I've read that when it came to Free as a Bird, you know, McCartney was pushing for a big string arrangement, like an Eleanor Rigby or one of those kind of things, and George Harrison was saying, I think it needs a slide guitar solo, and Paul McCartney's worst fear was that he was thinking, oh, okay, here we go, My Sweet Lord again. You know, like he didn't want them to have they didn't want to leave any trace of their solo careers that they'd had since the Beatles on these songs, so that he was really kind of particular on how he played the guitar solo and making sure it was more bluesy rather than soulful. And yeah, I just think he hit the ball out the park, wasn't it, to be honest.
And Ringo can't go underappreciated on these either.
No.
He was playing great on them. I mean, he's not doing anything really complicated, but actually it's a different sort of challenge to play along to, because you're trying to play as stripped back as you can. You know, when I was laying this down, I was going, right, I put two cymbals up. I went, I'm only going to use crashes when I absolutely have to. And I took a few liberties with some fills here and there, but everything was in the Ringo style. I think even watching some of the video back, I can see myself trying to either get that sort of left-hand lead round the kit, or even just going around the kit one-handed and my left hand not doing anything, just to try and give it that sort of Ringo space.
Yeah.
You know, and I think the only sort of main difference that I put in, just to give it a bit of a change of mood, was just in that guitar solo. I just went to the ride because I thought it just needed that lift.
Yeah.
That it has on the original, but not from the ride. I think it's probably the tambourine and some other stuff in there that gives it that really big lift. But in our recording, I tried it without and I tried it with, and I went, yeah, it needed that ride cymbal just to really take it to the, you know, take it up when that slide hits.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if it was Free as a Bird. It might have been Real Love, and it was definitely Now and Then when they started to work on it in the 90s. One of the things they talk about in this article, and I've seen before, was that because of how kind of bad the tempo was, particularly on the cassette, and just the way they had to kind of isolate everything to get it and then put it back together, one of the things they had to do was make Ringo record each drum individually. So, and in different rooms as well sometimes to get the effect. So I think, and in the end, ultimately, obviously on Now and Then, that wasn't used, but because they were trying to make just a really rough demo that they could then start working on, he recorded the snare in the kitchen, just going and even on the video, on the videos that they did use from the 90s, the footage of them, you can see he's not really playing the whole kit at times. He's just kind of hitting the snare or just the hi-hat and the snare. And which is something Jeff Lynne didn't want to do and absolutely hated doing, and I'm sure Ringo did as well.
Yeah.
But it was the only way they could try and start making it workable.
Yeah, because I mean, these were days even before really click tracks were massive. It was still they were still doing it very analog, and I know Ringo has a great aversion to the click track.
We'll have to put that on the socials.
But yeah, he has a bit of an aversion, and you know, having pulled all those files into Logic, I can tell you here and now they didn't use a click track.
Yeah,
because I couldn't.
That's what was the most surprising thing to me was when we started to work on this track, and you did all the lining up, and you said, you know, I can't get the tempo right. So I kind of worked it. I said, I think it's like, I can't remember what it was now in BPM, but I found as it starts where it should be. I was like, oh, it's fine. What was the problem? And then just as it goes, it just slowly speeds up, the slows down, which you can't tell listening to it. But
yeah. I mean, all I gave myself at the start of that is I midied 4 wood blocks that were in time, and that was all of the click that I used for re-recording that. And in fact, I took the drums off. You would think that sounds a bit counterproductive to be recording to a track that has drums on, but I didn't want to hear them. But it was to try and lock in with the piano and the bass, because the piano is kind of what's driving that song.
Yeah.
The John Lennon piano, and then McCartney's bass, which is really tight to that. So in the end, I took the drums off completely when I was recording. I didn't listen to Ringo at all, and I thought it would be interesting to then put Ringo's drums back up alongside what I'd done, just to see how close I was, and it was pretty close. You know, there wasn't a lot of there wasn't really any difference in terms of where the placement was, which shows how good Ringo was back then. You know, that I was looking at waveforms to see where the tempos were. They didn't have that. They didn't have the luxury of all of that 30 years ago when they were looking at them. You know, they were dealing with analog. You know, dealing with cassettes, and probably it being Paul McCartney's studio, I presume they were probably recording to tape. Even then, you know, even if they weren't recording to it in the first stage, they were using tape to get that sort of vintagey analog sound on it. But yeah, it was a bit of a task to get right, and I also challenged myself to do it in one take. I was like, if I'm going to do this, it's got to be a one-take job. You know, there's nowhere to hide in that song. There's no way that I wanted to get a splice or anything or drop anything in. So yeah, it was do it a few times until you get the take, and
yeah,
it was one go. You know, you've seen the video of me actually recording it, which was the video that you see in the video. That was the take.
Yeah,
you know, that was drum wise, at least. I don't know about you, if you did any you know, recording it first and videoing it later, but for me, no, it was the video. The take I videoed was the take that was used.
Yeah, no, same here, and yeah, I think sort of going on to you know, Real Love briefly. I've kind of gone to the guitar. Well, all of that stuff is true of Real Love as well, with the guitar work again from George Harrison. I love on it, and I wonder if you would know about the answer to this, but or if you've noticed this, that on the video for Real Love that you can find on YouTube, some of it's slightly different, as in the vocal sounds a bit cleaner now. I don't know if they've gone back and remixed it, and some of the guitar parts are different, as in the solos.
Yeah, I think I had noticed that, but I haven't looked into it, so I couldn't give a definitive answer as to why. The only thing you could maybe say was there a single version, and then the version that went on the Anthology project. Potentially that was where the difference was, or that they've just gone back and remastered it. But remastering it wouldn't have changed guitar parts. So that's a bit of an interesting one, and maybe a question for a future episode.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I froze up there.
Carry on.
Yeah, so I know with Free as a Bird, they did go back and do another mix of it in 2015, I believe. And when you watch the video on YouTube now, that's the new mix and sort of some changes in that. But I wondered if it was the same with Real Love. But I know, sort of looking into it for this video, I know people for ages have been saying how sort of, again, the chords are unique. And I've never tried to learn or anything, so I did my research, and yeah, it kind of is like a normal chord sequence, and then all of a sudden there's a G augmented in there, just like to throw at you, which comes round all the time. And I think like only the Beatles and only John Lennon could make that just sound like a normal chord in a pop song.
I mean, that's praise if any, isn't it? Take an unusual chord and make it better.
Yeah, and again, harmonies I think are great. Check them out on YouTube. And not to jump the gun here, but one of the shout-outs I would give are to some guys called the REO Brothers, I believe they're called, which I watched on YouTube the other day. They've done this. I think they kind of specialise on covering Beatles songs, and they put these Free as a Bird, Real Love, and Now and Then into a kind of medley. And I just think the way they all work together, you can absolutely hear John Lennon's writing style at the time, but also they just work great together, I think. And they're all so bittersweet because it sort of feels like the end of something, and they're not upbeat songs by any means. But I would say go check those guys out in that video. But yeah, Real Love, I love it. And it could have easily been the end of the Beatles, like their last song, but wasn't to be.
No, we got one more out of them.
Yeah. And I know from some of our research, they've said there could even be more in the future. Who knows?
Yeah, that would be nice. For them to really go back and see if they can find even more stuff in the archives.
Yeah,
I'm sure there's stuff lingering around, especially from the later sessions when they were starting to bring their own songs in. So, like I think George got them to record a version of All Things Must Pass at one point.
Yeah.
I can't remember if that was the White Album or Let It Be.
Let It Be, I think.
Yeah, but that songs like that were about at that sort of time that people were bringing in. So who knows what else is in EMI or Apple's archives?
Yeah.
I think, to be honest, from what Peter Jackson said when he first started looking at the Get Back project, he said they don't even know what they've got.
Yeah.
I don't think they know what's in there. So hopefully there's enough people around now who are good custodians like Peter Jackson or Giles Martin who can sort of take ownership of the stuff and make sure that stuff that should be heard is.
Well, wasn't it when they did that film a couple of years ago, the 8 Days a Week film with Ron Howard directing it, that they kind of reached out to people to see if anybody had any footage, because it was just about the touring years, any footage they knew about, and some woman just said, oh yeah, well, I know I went to see the Beatles at somewhere, it might have been Candlestick Park or somewhere, their last concert. So I definitely went to see them, so I just had a look around, and I had this under my bed for the last 50 years, and it was a full video of the concert on her camera, and didn't know she had for that long, so you never know what's lying around.
Yeah, or Paul McCartney's lost bass lying in an attic.
Yeah, maybe that's an episode. Maybe that's an episode we can get into when we know more.
Yeah, that would be good, because that's another story that is so incredible that it's come about, and it's just a shame it's come about too late to have been used on Now and Then.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I don't know about you, but I think we're just about ready to wrap up this episode.
Yeah, I think we've covered quite a bit. If you haven't already, go and check out our version of Free as a Bird. Give Ashley's YouTube channel a subscribe, because there will be more on the way. In the Beatles vein, as we continue to delve down the rabbit hole that is some of the isolated tracks that are around.
Yes, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I certainly have. And we'll see you next time.
See you next time.